For this episode of Scholar Talks, we're going to discuss how the Bible helped shape the American founding. Now, our guest Daniel Dreisbach is a professor of law, justice, and criminology at American University. He's the author and editor of several books on the American founding and religion, including a must-read, Thomas Jefferson and the Wall of Separation Between Church and State, and today's topic, Reading the Bible with the Founding Fathers. I am Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of Scholar Talks in the America 250 series. Daniel, I want to thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to join you today.
Yeah, I'm very intrigued. I can't wait to jump into the conversation. We think about a lot of different influences on the founders, and you've really shown quite definitively that the Bible and Protestant Christianity did in fact have a profound influence. And that leads me to my first question. Why don't we go ahead and jump? So, to the usual argument that the American founding had a lot of different influences, such as Locke and the Enlightenment, Greece and Rome, modern liberalism, the English tradition, you add the Bible and Protestant Christianity. So, my question is, why is this important?
So, we all know that the American founders were extraordinarily well read, and they drew on diverse intellectual traditions to inform their own political thought and their political experiments. You mentioned some very important sources of influence. We think of the English common law and constitutionalism, Enlightenment liberalism in manifold forms. We could also add to that classical and civic republicanism. And if we were to go down to a good research library at a local university, we're literally going to find shelves of books written on the influence of Enlightenment thought on the American founding, John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, and the like. But I dare say we're not going to find many books on the influence of the Bible and Christianity on the American founding. And I think it's a vital part of understanding the influences that informed not only their worldview in a general sense, but their political projects, their political enterprises. And so this is really what inspired me to take up this topic because I don't think we can adequately understand the broad range of ideas that informed the political thought of the founding generation without including the Bible and the Christian tradition into that mix. Many of the founding generation, for example, looked to the Bible to inform their views on things like human nature, civic responsibility, the rights and responsibilities of citizenship, what constitutes a legitimate government. These are the kinds of topics that are so important in creating a new political society. And so these are questions that the founders have that they're looking to the Bible to help them understand how to move forward with their experiment. And let me just give you one example here. I think a starting point, in fact, a number of the founders say this is the starting point of any political theory, and that is to understand human nature. And so I think we find example after example of American founders saying our understanding of human nature comes from the Bible. They're reading the story of the fall in the Garden of Eden, and they're looking to Genesis chapter 3. And what they conclude is that humankind is fallen, is sinful, and this becomes a very central part of their political project. And so they build a political system that is designed to check and restrain the acts of selfish, sinful people. And we end up with a constitution that is obsessed with things like checks and balances and separation of powers. And I think this arises from a biblical understanding of who mankind is.
Fascinating. Really good. And as a follow-up, so thinking you write a little bit about actually a topic we've attended a conference together on, Protestant resistance theory. Tell me a little bit about that. 'Cause as I was reading the book, I was really struck by, I was like, boy, this is natural rights and the purpose of government and the right of revolution, right of resistance. I was like, wow, that's like the Declaration, right? And we usually talk about Locke and the Declaration, but you show the origins can be a little earlier than that.
That's right. So, let's look at it this way. And again, I think a good starting point here is a biblical text. And I would turn to Romans chapter 13, the first 7 verses, which speaks of that obligation of citizens to be in submission to those in authority over them. Now, for a pious American people, this idea that you must be in submission to your rulers is a challenging text if you're contemplating rebellion or resistance to George III in Parliament. And so, and by the way, this has been a challenging text for people throughout history. Most immediately in our past history, we might look to the English Civil Wars and the rebellion against Charles I, for example. Pious people in England had to grapple with this kind of text. Now, those who want to affirm the power of a Charles I in the mid 17th century, or the power of George III in the mid to late 18th century, they're going to emphasize this idea that you must be in submission to those in authority over you. But what Christians have often done in history is they brought a very nuanced reading of Romans 13 that goes something like this. Yes, civil government and civil magistrates are ordained by God, but government and magistrates are ordained to serve the public good. Now, that last part is key to the argument because the way patriotic Americans read Romans 13 is yes, government is ordained of God. Yes, we are to be in submission to government, but so long as it serves the public good. If a ruler becomes a tyrant, if a ruler begins to serve his own interests and not the interests of the people, then that ruler, in a sense, deposes himself and is no longer entitled to that obligation of obedience. Now, let me just point you to some language in the Declaration of Independence, right? George III is somewhat described as a tyrant, is he not? That very language of a tyrant is used. But there's a little line in the Declaration of Independence I want to draw your attention to. Notice that the Declaration says George III has abdicated his office. We often skip over that line, but I think it's key. And that's a point being made here is that George III ceases to serve the public good. And in that sense, he's deposed or abdicated the office and is therefore no longer entitled to that obedience required by Romans chapter 13. In fact, we often hear patriots say it, not only is disobedience to a tyrant allowed, but it's even a duty to resist a tyrant. It's the Christian duty to resist a tyrant. And so it's a very interesting, nuanced reading of Scripture. We may disagree about the veracity of this interpretation, but this is an interpretation of Scripture that patriotic Americans are making here at this moment of rebellion and resistance against George III in Parliament.
Right. And I was going to ask this later. Let me ask it now. So the Bible, you're saying, is it was a source of unity, but it could also be interpreted differently by Tories and by patriots. So, and that leads to a division over whether this is legitimate authority or not, which is
Yeah,
basically
I think there's a consensus that the Bible is an authoritative text.
right.
It is a text to be venerated, but as I think you rightly state, that doesn't mean that Americans in the late 18th century, nor Christians throughout history, have always shared a common understanding or interpretation of specific biblical text. And this is a good example of a text, Romans 13, that loyalists tended to interpret somewhat differently from patriotic Americans. And we're going to, again, not only find at this time, but at other times in history where there have been disagreements about what does the Bible have to say about slavery, for example?
Right.
Or what does the Bible have to say about, to use the language of a later age, separation of church and state? Is this required by Scripture or not? And so, yes, they share a veneration of Scripture, but there are going to be these instances where there are pretty significant disagreements as to the application and in interpretation of the Bible to the moment that Americans find themselves in.
Right, and this splits, clerics and churches, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right, right. And again, it's not only these are not only disagreements among individual citizens, but it's going to begin to divide larger religious communities, religious societies, what we might even call religious denominations and churches.
Right, right. Okay, good. So, how was the Bible important to, you mentioned in the book, education, private lives, and really shape the common culture in an overwhelmingly not only Protestant, but also highly literate, especially in New England, colonial population?
That's right. So, first of all, Americans in the late 18th century are, let me put it this way. Americans of European descent are overwhelmingly Protestant. Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 98% or more of all Americans would have identified in some sense with Protestantism. And the Bible looms large in Protestant culture. If you remove the church and its priest as mediators between God and man, then the Bible sort of becomes very important in understanding what God is speaking to us. And so, going all the way back to the earliest days of the Protestant Reformation in Europe, the Bible, it becomes a very important part of that culture. And alongside with the Bible, translating the Bible into the vernacular tongue becomes very important. So again, you're removing the role of the church and its priest as a reader and interpreter of the Bible, and you're putting it in the hands of the common person. And alongside that, literacy education becomes vitally important. It's important that the individual believer be able to read the Bible in his or her own language. And so literacy education becomes an important part of Protestant culture. Now, let's just put this a little bit more precisely in late 18th century America. Again, the Bible is largely accepted as the most authoritative, venerated text. It's also the most accessible text. If a if a farmer out there on the frontier had one Bible, that one book, excuse me, that one book almost certainly would have been the Bible, right? And interestingly, the King James Bible is written in a kind of language, a rather simple language that makes it an ideal tool for literacy education. And I think we can say fairly accurately that the vast majority of Americans who were, by the way, literate at the end of the 18th century were seeing the highest rates of literacy that perhaps we've ever seen in human history. The chances are that Americans are learning to read with a copy of the Bible in front of them, right? They're learning to read from the language of the Bible. So not only are they getting literacy education, but they're incorporating into their education the content of the Bible. It's literary allusions, it's metaphors, figures of speech, it's parables, it's stories. It's moral codes and the like. And so I think this is going to have an enormous influence on the broader culture. And I think whatever we might say about the influence, for example, of Enlightenment thought, in a more immediate sense, Americans are developing their private morality from biblical texts. And we're going to begin to see the Bible incorporated into the curriculum of education from the primary education right up through the college level. And let's remind ourselves, still in the 18th century, most colleges in America were essentially seminaries to
Right.
train young men for the ministry to serve in the pulpit. And so the Bible is just a fundamental part of education, and that's going to extend its influence in very significant ways across the culture.
Good, good. So thinking, moving into the American Revolution and the American founding. So, the founders had differing religious views, broadly Protestant, as you said, but they all and some were a little more unorthodox than others, but they all seem to agree on this basic founding syllogism that religion was the basis of morality, and morality and virtue was necessary for self-government. So can you tease that out a little bit for us?
Sure, sure. I think this is an idea that goes to the heart of their Republican theory, okay? Their Republican theory of government. Again, the founding generation would have been largely in agreement,
Mhm.
acknowledging, as you say, that there's disagreements in their sort of ecclesiastical affiliations and the like, but they're largely agreed that virtue and morality is absolutely essential to their rather bold experiment in Republican self-government. Authoritarian rulers, tyrants, can maintain social order and discipline by use of the whip and the rod, the external controls of the whip and the rod. But clearly, the whip and the rod is unacceptable for a free, independent, self governing people. And so, a challenging question confronted by the founding generation is, in a system of self-government, what replaces the external control of the whip and the rod? And it's on this point that the American founders are going to incline themselves to nurture internal monitors, internal controls that replace the external control of the whip and the rod. This internal monitor is going to be what we might think of as civic virtue.
Mhm.
So civic virtue becomes vital to their project in Republican self-government. Now, the next question becomes, well, what nurtures that civic virtue? And it's on this point that many Americans, I'm not going to say all Americans, but many Americans are going to look to the Bible as a vital tool in training the American people to develop that internal moral compass that replaces the external control of the whip and the rod. And so this is, I think, how we get to this syllogism, as you put it, this idea that virtue and morality are necessary for Republican self-government, and religion is necessary for nurturing virtue. Therefore, we might conclude, in the minds of the founders, that religion is necessary for Republican self-government to work. Now, just to sort of to put a capstone on this, John Adams is one of several American founders who says this, and this quote always captures my attention. John Adams said, and he's by no means alone in saying this. John Dickinson says almost exactly the same thing. Other founders say very similar things, but John Adams says, the Bible is the most Republican book in the world, right? It's a strange thing from a 21st century mind to hear said, right? In what sense is the Bible the most Republican book? Well, he's really speaking to this syllogism.
Mhm.
He's saying that if virtue is essential to Republican self-government and the Bible is essential to nurturing those civic virtues, in that sense, because he believes the Bible is the best handbook ever made for teaching virtue, it is the most Republican book that you can think of. And again, it's a very strange statement to be made from our very modern perspective, but I think if you understand that mindset of the American founding and this syllogism, it makes perfect sense.
Right, right. Excellent. So how does the Bible then shape the political discourse of the American Revolution and founding?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me just sort of take one step back, if I might,
Sure.
and let's talk about the importance of the Bible to that discourse. The late political scientist at the University of Houston, Donald Lutz, published an article in the flagship publication for American political scientists back in the 1980s, in which he found, this is the finding of his study, that the Bible was by far the most cited work in the political literature of the American founding. His study found that about one third of all citations in the political literature of the American founding was to the Bible. In fact, the book of Deuteronomy was the most cited book. Deuteronomy is cited much more frequently, for example, than all of John Locke's works put together. It's cited more frequently than all the works of Montesquieu. And Locke and Montesquieu are important to the founders, but the book of Deuteronomy alone is more frequently cited. So, starting from the proposition that the Bible is being referenced, is being cited frequently in this political discourse, um, I think we have to go beyond Lutz's study in this sense. It's interesting to know that the Bible is frequently cited, but that may not tell us a whole lot about the influence of the Bible. I think the most important point that I try to make in the book is this. We got to move beyond simply counting quotations and try to understand the reasons or the purposes for which the Bible is being used. And the bottom line is this. The American founders are using the Bible for a variety of reasons. They are not simply using the Bible for theological or we might even say prophetic purposes. They're using it for a whole variety of reasons, from the strictly literary and the rhetorical uses of the Bible, as well as for theological purposes. And so when you see a reference to the Bible, I think you need to dig a little bit deeper and say, why is the Bible being used here? And by the way, this is advice not only in reading the literature of the American founding. I think this is good advice for when you hear a politician in 21st century America quote the Bible, right? You want to understand why they're using the Bible. And let me just suggest a couple of the reasons, several reasons. And again, there are many reasons, but let's just mention a couple of them, some obvious, perhaps some not so obvious. They're using it for it's as a literary resource. The King James translation of the Bible in particular is a rich storehouse of metaphors, figures of speech, aphorisms, and the like. Think about all those metaphors that we use in our daily lives. Think of phrases like the forbidden fruit, or the writing on the wall, or the lion's den, or walk the extra mile. These are all phrases, metaphors that have a biblical origin. And the founders are using the Bible in this sense, as well as other senses. I think they're also looking to the Bible for rhetorical purposes. Now, if you know the King James Bible, which is the translation of the Bible that would have been most familiar to the American founding, you know that there's a very distinct cadence to the language of the King James Bible. There is it's of course an Elizabethan Jacobean sort of English language, but it has very distinct cadences. And so I think what you're going to find is that skillful speakers and writers in the American founding, think of a Benjamin Franklin or a Thomas Paine, they're constantly using the Bible, but here's where it gets really interesting. They're using Bible-like language. And I think what they're using here is the cadence, the rhythm, that Jacobean type language to add a kind of weight or gravitas to their arguments, to their rhetoric today. By the way, no one in American history has been more skillful at this than Abraham Lincoln, right? To jump ahead a generation or
Sure.
two. And let me just take you to one example, and we could spend a whole session on this alone.
Correct.
But let's go to the Gettysburg Address, right? How does he begin? fourscore and 7 years ago. That's an odd way of saying 87. Why does he say that? I think he's using a mode of expression that comes straight out of the King James Bible, probably Psalm 90:10. Man has threescore and 10 years on this earth, he says in Psalm. I think what Lincoln is doing here, he's using a Bible-like, he's not quoting the Bible, but he's using Bible-like mode of expression to put his audience from the very first word into a biblical frame of mind. He says, I've got something very serious to say. But he doesn't stop there. He goes fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers, which is the language from the Pentateuch, speaking of the patriarchs. It's the language from the Lord's Prayer, our Father who art in heaven. But he doesn't stop there. He goes, brought forth, our fathers brought forth. Brought forth is the language of creation story in Genesis chapter 1 in the King James translation. It's the language of the Exodus story. Moses brought forth the children of Israel out of bondage. It's the language of Matthew chapter 1. Mary brought forth a child. Now, what's interesting here is these aren't direct quotations in any obvious sense to the Bible, but it's the use of Bible-like, specifically King James translation-like language to impact the weight, the gravitas of the rhetoric. Now, more than that, the Bible, of course, is being used for very practical purposes, political purposes. They see in the Bible models of let's say, for example, separation of powers, right? They read in Deuteronomy chapter 16, 17, and 18 about the separation of powers between prophet, priest, and king. And they see here a model of separation of powers. They see models for republicanism. They might have looked, for example, to Exodus chapter 18, where there's a kind of rudimentary model of republicanism that's being developed in ancient Israel. They see a model of due process in Exodus chapter 23. So they're seeing here ideas, models, perhaps worthy of emulation in their own experience. But they're also using the Bible for profoundly theological reasons. They see in the Bible stories that give insights into the ways of God and providence and how God deals with many nations. And that's important to them, right? They want to enjoy God's favor. And so they want to read how in the pages of Scripture, they see evidence of how God deals with humankind in the material world. So they're using the Bible in a lot of different ways, not just theological, but also literary, rhetorical, in profoundly political and also theological ways.
Right, right. I could have listened to you talk about Lincoln and Gettysburg all day long. But it's also what you just said about God dealing with nations is a great segue into my next question, which is how does this idea of America as a new Israel, as a chosen people, and covenant theology shape American republicanism?
Yeah. So, by the way, I think we should start by acknowledging that Americans throughout history have seen themselves as a new Israel, right? The
Mhm.
Pilgrims, the Puritans, back in the earliest days of the 17th century, thought of themselves as God's new Israel. They described themselves. They were an oppressed people in Egypt, meaning England, suffering political and religious oppression under their Stuart monarchs, who were, by the way, their Pharaoh. They cross the Atlantic Ocean, their Red Sea. They come into a new promised land. So as far as back as the early 17th century, Americans are making this comparison. Americans in the founding era are going to make the same comparison. George III is their pharaoh. We all remember how George Washington was often compared to Cincinnatus, right? The Roman dictator, general, who returns to the plow in the field. But we forget, by the way, that George Washington was compared more frequently to Moses, a liberator of his people, then he was compared to Cincinnatus. And by the way, this is a comparison Americans are going to make into the 19th century. It's part of the rhetoric of the abolitionist movement. It's going to be part of the rhetoric of the civil rights movement in the 20th century. Martin Luther King Jr. comes back time and again to this metaphor of living under oppression and the need for liberation and the hope of a new promised land. So this is a part of the American story. It's been a part of American rhetoric from the beginning, even continuing to the present day. But what does that reveal to us? It suggests that Americans see themselves, like the ancient Israelites, as God's chosen people. Or perhaps to use more modern theological language, the elect, right? They're God's elect. And has favored them, maybe entitled to God's special chastisement from time to time, but nonetheless, God's chosen people. Or let's not forget that wonderful rephrasing from Abraham Lincoln, God's almost chosen people, right? He wants to stop just a little bit short of that complete comparison. But I think it also reveals that Americans have seen themselves in a covenantal relationship with God. Of course, that goes to the very heart of what it means to be in a covenant. God is part of this arrangement. God is part of this agreement. So not only do they see themselves as part of a covenant with God in this political experiment, in Republican self-government, but they also see themselves in covenant with each other in the trying times that they are in and that surely lie ahead.
Right, and that tie. So can you explain basically covenant a little bit in terms of God punishing and God blessing and that kind of thing.
So we see throughout the scripture God entering into a number of covenants, agreements with individuals and even the nation Israel. There are complete texts, for example, in Leviticus, I think Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, great covenant texts that speak of the promises God makes to those who honor him, but also, and this should be frightening, the curses to those who reject God. But God also makes covenant relationships with individuals. God enters into a covenant with Adam, with Abraham. And we see this over and over again. Again, God's entering into an agreement that He's going to honor if those on the other side of the agreement honor Him. There are great what we sometimes call covenant lawsuit texts. In my book, I have a chapter on a verse called Micah 6:8, where it's really a text about a lawsuit that God has with Israel. Israel has departed from God, and he's got a grievance against his people. And he lays out his reasons as to why he believes the nation Israel has abandoned him. And what's interesting in Micah chapter 6 is the nation Israel doesn't contest the accusation of a departure from this agreement. Rather, it acknowledges it, and Israel says, what must we do to bring ourselves back into right alignment with you, O God? And God, speaking through his prophet, the prophet Micah, says, you must do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. That's what's required to bring a people, a nation, back into alignment with God and that covenantal relationship. Now, what's interesting that Americans were drawn to this text, this language of a covenant and how to maintain a right relationship with God. Here they are in the late 18th century, and they are appealing to this conflict of the prophet Micah and the nation Israel two and a half millennia before. And it suggests that Americans in the late 18th century continue to see themselves as part of a covenant relationship, and they're concerned and interested in maintaining that relationship and that agreement between God and his people. Of course, these Americans are thinking of themselves as God's elect, God's chosen people. Again, we may have disagreements about their theology and interpretation, but it puts you, I think, in the frame of mind of late 18th century Americans and how they related to the texts of Scripture.
Right. And so, final question in a nutshell, kind of summing things up, how did the Bible shape the American founding? Big question, but
Okay. I like it when we end on an easy question, right?
yeah, yeah.
Let me just reiterate something I said at the beginning, because I don't want us to lose sight of this. We've been emphasizing the influence of the Bible, and it's important, but I don't want to dismiss or ignore other intellectual influences, right? So there's a kind of a synthesis of a variety of influences on the American founding, many of which are not spiritual or religious in any sense whatsoever. And
Mhm.
yet Americans are drawing on these diverse influences in sort of establishing their political project there at the end of the 18th century. As we've said before, I'm going to say it again. I think uh, 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 the Bible is shaping how they view essential concepts that one must grapple with if you're trying to establish a new government, starting with who is this government for? What is human nature? We want to create a government that takes into account human nature with its flaws as well as whatever virtues it might have. And so, as we've already talked about, it helps, the Bible helps the American founders understand human nature. And I can't overstate how vital that is to not only the government, but the constitutions they write. The Constitution is obsessed with creating a government that takes into account human beings who can't be trusted with power, right? We have a constitution with checks within checks within checks. And I don't think we're going to get there unless we understand a kind of biblical understanding of human nature that the American founders were tapping into. It helps us understand things like separation of powers and the like. But it's also going to help us understand, sort of other essential features of our Constitution. And we could go principle by principle. I think concepts like cruel and unusual punishment is informed by Mosaic law and limitations that the Mosaic law put on punishments. It also informs, for example, principles like double jeopardy, right? Double jeopardy, it was often said, was taken out of the book of the prophet Nahum, and this comes out in a Bible commentary written by Saint Jerome 1500 years ago and is woven into the English common law and is brought across the Atlantic as part of the Puritan tradition. But again, it seems to have some kind of biblical origins, at least in the thinking of Americans as they come to the New World. So the Bible is going to be woven into many aspects, not only of our general understanding of government, but even specific features of our constitutional tradition. And so I sometimes say, and I'll offer this by way perhaps of a conclusion, to better understand our constitutional government, I think we would all do well to read the Bible because it's going to be exerting its influence on that tradition in multiple ways.
Great. Great. Great interview. Daniel Dreisbach, you're a long-time friend of BRI. So I want to thank you very much for joining us to discuss this important topic as we are preparing to celebrate America 250.
Well, thank you so much, Tony, for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. Thank you again. And thank you all for joining us for this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out the other interviews in our America 250 series on our channel and don't forget to click subscribe.